All right, APHUG, it is late, but I've got some notes to cover here with you. Good mover. So we took a look together in class at some different models. Get where I want to be here as far as some notes go. All right, there we go. So we took a look at the concentric zone model. We looked at the sector model, and we looked at the multiple nuclei model. Um, and the little cutout sheet that I gave you covers those three. There's one more that we'll throw into the mix that wasn't on that sheet, and that is the galactic city model, which sounds like it's something really cool out of some sci-fi movie or something. But it's not. Sorry, nothing quite that fancy. Um, this is kind of the idea, and I think it's looking a little bit more of kind of the more modern as we're kind of going late 20th and into the 21st century. And so it is this idea of a lot of the different services that traditionally would be located there, and right there in the center, and the business central business district. That this is now beginning. We're starting to see more and more where these are spreading into the suburbs, and so we see a little bit more of that mixed use where we have residential and then some commercial, not necessarily sitting side by side, but being adjacent to each other. When we have that kind of a creation going on, when we're seeing that movement with some of those services away from the CBD, that gets us into this area that we refer to as edge cities. And so cities that are on the periphery, on the edge of where the bigger where the central business district is, and then just really just having their own ability to kind of take care of their own with businesses and that kind of a thing. All right. And when we see the creation of edge cities, we usually also see a consequence of that being a negative result in the heart of the CBD. And a lot of times, as we see those services leaving that part, it leaves remains to become kind of this kind of poor, kind of a lot of abandoned buildings and things kind of shut down. But we see a decline in conditions in the inner city, in and around the CBD. Okay, all right. So where I'm going to take you next is we're gonna take a little spin and look at some of these models in other parts of the world. I'm going to start you off with the Griffin Ford model, which refers back to there's a couple of I'm trying to remember, Griffin Ford, one name or two names? I don't know. I think as long as we have the names down there, we're good. It is a model that we use to refer to cities that are mainly located in parts of Latin America. To kind of break it down, the big difference when we look at this, we look at the Griffin Ford model, is that there's kind of this concept of two CBDs that are going to be located in a city. Your first one goes a little back further in time, and so this might be what used to be the city center, going back, in a lot of cases we're talking like centuries, and this can go back some parts of Latin America. This goes back into colonial times, that sort of thing. So when we talk about this historic market system, that is one that's been around for a long, long time. And then joining that, you have a more modern version, so one that gets more into the 20th and early 21st century. And so kind of, you'll see the picture here. You see how they're stacked. You got the market system up here, and then you got more of the modern CBD down there. Okay, so you got them both. All right, and that is one part of what's going on there. Then you get this concept of a spine. Let's get it's kind of a little bit of the sector approach that we saw, where there's like these wedges, and what we're going to find in a lot of these Latin American cities is there is this what they call a spine. So you have this kind of moving outward from the CBD, You're going to have a lot of businesses that are going to run kind of on either side of this. You'll also have some homes along here as well. And sometimes they tend to be a little bit more of your kind of maybe higher level homes, that sort of thing. And then where it will terminate out at the end is what is called a mall, and it's not the mall that you and I think about, like the big shopping center, but it isn't too far off from that. The mall may be that endpoint may be more housing people live. It still may be some businesses mixed in there as well. Okay, but don't confuse it with kind of like a shopping mall. All right. Um, let's see. And so as we here's where things kind of go in a different direction than those North American models we were looking at, and that is that where we see some of hold on just a sec here. All right, sorry, there I was going to sneeze. It is the opposite of what we see in North America. So we see, as we get further and further out away from the CBD, from the market area, that the price of and the quality of housing is going to go rapidly kind of downhill the further out we go. Okay, where you've got right in that area there, you're going to see some of the you're going to pay more, and you're going to see better quality housing. Very different from North America, where we see the best housing out there in the suburbs and getting into the residential areas away from the CBD. And that in some of those North American models, even like we were talking about with the Galactic model, sometimes we're going to see portions of that CBD look very, very run down. And so we see kind of this flip flop of that with a lot of our Latin American examples that we look at, especially when we're considering the Griffin Ford model. Okay, some examples of that. I always go back and forth on the pronunciation of this because, well, my Spanish is horrible. Periférico. These are kind of, and then shanty towns. This is what you're going to see. And if you'll notice here, you'll see some of the periférico here, some of the periférico over here. And this is where you're getting into this kind of low quality, relatively inexpensive, cheap housing. Shanty towns is even kind of a step down even from that. And where you're getting people who are living in really some really challenging environments from that point in time. And that is what you see as you get further and further out. And then if you notice, when we talk about that spine's kind of the protected part. And that wedge that goes out there, is gonna you're not gonna see that run down, lesser quality kind of housing. It'll be kind of insulated from that. Okay, but the rest of the area around here, definitely we're talking about that kind of sort of thing going on. And then same when we talk about favelas and barrios. These are also names that are given to some of these neighborhoods where there's no plan. There is a lot of times they're not hooked up to city services, that sort of thing. Okay, I forgot to mention this picture shows you a really good shot up here. If I go backwards, you can see it. That's showing you that spine area there in that photograph. Don't get a lot of good pictures that really put that on display, but that one does. Disamenity zones are what we can see develop out of the favelas, the barrios, periféricos, any of these kind of low rent and just low quality. Disamenity zone is kind of where you end up with a part of a town that ends up basically like under the control of gangs, or maybe some kind of like a criminal cartel or organization. It's like they're beyond the law. They're beyond the kind of the normal running of a city, and an area that can be generally considered to be pretty dangerous for people to having to do with. So I don't want you to consider that this is just how every Latin American city is, but this is a model when we look at Griffin Ford that we see repeated in a good number of Latin American cities. And so that will cover Latin America. We headed on over to Europe. I think we're going to spend a little bit of time in Europe here. And definitely history plays a role in Europe. I've actually going to see history playing a role pretty much everywhere. I think that's one of the things that makes America, the United States, a little different, is because we're newer, and so I think our models reflect that. When we look at European models, some of them are these old walled cities going back to like medieval times, and with a lot of cities in Europe, we have still a lot of history that exists. Even post World War II, I mean, some parts of Europe were severely damaged. Germany was, bombed to pieces, and then some of the countries that Germany bombed during the war. But even in those countries, there's still a lot of historical buildings, and a lot of times, I mean, countries take a lot of pride in this. I mean, when I was in Italy, I mean, you're constantly stumbling upon these structures that have been standing since the 12th century, the 11th century, some of them older than that, and so they want to preserve those. That's their history. That's their culture, and but that definitely makes development, urban development, more difficult. Really throws some challenges in there, and so that's a little bit what we referred to there in number one. And because of that, it really does kind of create some issues when it comes to fully developing a CBD. And so what we see as a result of that is kind of a little bit of a similarity to what we see in some of our North American models, where you see more of the people living in suburb areas around the CBD. So a lot more of kind of that whole kind of commuter kind of a thing for people who still live in, or excuse me, work in the city, but then live outside. Okay, so you've got that. African cities. Let's see. To take a look at those, think about what we learned about Africa back in Unit 4. Well, actually, we've learned it more about just Unit 4, but just the real significant colonial history of Africa. That idea that during the heyday of imperialism, the vast majority of Africa was under the control of outsiders, mainly European countries, and that definitely has a major influence in the development of African cities, because a lot of that development that happened in the 19th and going into the 20th century came basically at the hands and at the behest of European colonizers. And so we have that. And in some parts of Africa, the fact that they were colonized really limited urban development, because, maybe that colony was being used mainly as an agricultural colony to supply, cash crops for a European country, that kind of a thing. What we see in general is that with most of the African nations winning their independence, we see kind of imperialism finally wither away and die after World War II. And so the 1950s and 1960s are a big time for African countries to gain their independence. And what we see following that, and really picking up and accelerating here as we go in the 21st century, is this idea of rapid growth of cities. It's not impacting every bit and part of Africa, but there's a lot of parts of Africa where we're seeing this happening. Okay. When it comes to central business districts in there, you're going to have kind of this idea of, in some cases, some CBDs that have their roots going all the way back to pre-19th, really in some cases even 18th century, when Europeans first started to show up and started establishing colonies. So some of them have some connections back to days even before the Europeans showed up. And then you've got CBDs that have really, really tight connection to when these various parts of Africa were under European control. Informal economic zones and then periodic markets. We see this in a lot of the CBDs of Africa. And what we're talking about with those are going to be street markets, basically what I would call an when we talk about formal economic zones, that is where you have, businesses that are operating that, I mean, they've got official storefronts. They operate under the regulations of, a city or county. Everything is above board. They're responsible in terms of, they pay their business taxes. I mean, everything is totally formalized. Informal is a little bit different than that. Sometimes not following regulations, sometimes getting into a little bit of what we refer to as kind of black market, maybe sometimes dealing in goods that are not illegal but not totally legal at the same time. Those kinds of things. And then periodic markets are markets where they operate monthly, or they operate just once a year, and set up for business, and then kind of poof, they're gone until the next time they set up. So there's a lot of that kind of goes on in some of these African cities. Um, and some of it is a reflection of that very rapid growth that we've seen. Okay, and then we also see growing in parts of some of these African cities, a growth in these manufacturing and residential zones, um, and just again another reflection of the rapid growth. And then informal settlements. When we talk about squatter settlements, I mean it's kind of getting somewhat again similar to what we talked about with the barrios, perifericos, that kind of thing. And when we're talking about squatter settlements, that's getting in there, very much like we talked about before. Um, Parts of cities that come together by some of the poorer people in the cities. No planning, no electricity, no sewage, no utilities at all. And like it says there, people just creating some kind of a structure, usually using found materials, and building it wherever they can find enough space to do it. All right. From there, we'll flip over and look at some of the city models that we see existing in the Middle East and kind of Arab, Islamic kind of cities. With these, definitely the role of Islam is gonna loom large in this. If you take some AP World next year, you'll learn about the significance of the faith. This is going to be, in the early days, they built an empire that's completely built around the Islamic faith. Fast forward nowadays, don't have an empire anymore, but we do have a whole lot of countries that are predominantly Muslim. And so the mosque, which is, the basically the house of faith, the same as a church, the same as a synagogue, it's a mosque in the Muslim world. And in a lot of these older cities, that mosque is right there in the CBD, and in some cases, it takes the place of the CBD. It is the center of the city. There'll be a lot of mosques typically in a Middle Eastern town, but usually there's going to be one large mosque, and it might be an oldest one. It just might be one that is the biggest that exists, and then usually around that mosque there's going to be everything from schools to different kinds of social services, that sort of thing. And so in a lot of those, that's what we have as far as that center. Okay. Citadel cities, also an aspect that we see in some parts of the Middle East. And again, another connection back to history, because this is kind of like what we we're talking about in Europe, where you have, kind of like these, it's a city, it's a fort, it's protected by these thick, tall walls. They don't really serve any real purpose nowadays. They are more of kind of a nod to, the history of certain cities. But we call those kind of fort-like cities citadels. And citadel is kind of a term nowadays that just kind of usually gets associated with, it's kind of like a city and it's also like a fortress kind of a thing. And we see some of that in existence in some parts of the Middle East. Souk, I think that's the correct pronunciation. And sometimes you see this word spelled Souqus, and then other times it's just Suqs. I don't know. I'm going to go with the OU because I'm seeing that pop up a little more frequently. And these are like the picture you see over there to the side. Some people call like day markets. street bazaars, that kind of thing. And these are very common in the Middle Eastern cities. And especially as you move beyond that mosque, that city center there, you'll see these that will pop up, and they're pretty. On the one hand, they're permanent, as in they're going to be in operation, day in and day out. But they don't actually a lot of times operate from an official storefront. It's more the market idea, okay, and again, fairly common. And then when it comes to residential areas, you in these Middle Eastern or these Islamic cities, a lot of times it's going to be again the idea of you're not going to have as many people living right there in the city center area. Most of them are going to be in residential areas that kind of emanate outward from that market area, from the from the market area. All right. And then let's see, heading down to Southeast Asia. Let's see how much more I can take care of here. Yeah. Let's go ahead and hit this. The McGee model, yet another geographer out there who studied how Southeast Asian cities came together, and again we get a little bit more. We get the stamp of colonialism because a lot of parts of Southeast Asia, some of them the British, some of them the French. We get a little bit of that influence, and there a little bit of Portuguese, I think, a little here and there. Yeah, we get that kind of influence. And so what we really see, one of the things you can remember with the McGee model is in Southeast Asia, there was much more importance being placed on trade. And so ports were really important back in the colonial days. They still are important to these independent countries now. But a lot of times that is where your CBD, that is where kind of the city center is going to actually be, is around, a port. You can think of it that way, or think of it like as a harbor, that sort of thing, right? And then some of the larger cities that you're going to find in Southeast Asia. Yeah, I mean, pretty much kind of what we expect typically, where you're going to have your commercial zones, your government zone, um, again, market gardening, if we want to make a little connection back to some of that agriculture. Some of those Southeast Asian countries, rice is a huge, agricultural product, all that kind of stuff. All right, so that will cover all that. I think I'm going to try to run us up here to about 30 minutes, being, I don't know, it's after midnight, so I guess I'm just going to be, I'm just doing videos all night. So Section 4 gets us into regulating. In other words, where law comes in and where rules come in to place some controls on how land is used in some of these urban landscapes. A lot of times there's going to be people who are going to be button heads when it comes to if there's planning going on, if there's new developments being being proposed. And it's the idea of trying to, everyone has their own idea of what they want to see. Some people want to see more green space. Some people want to see more development because that development will mean more tax base, and and then that tax base can be used for expanding mass transit. Everyone's got their priorities, and when it comes to regulations, these can be some issues that cause a lot of conflict as people try to figure out what's best for their own kind of urban setting. All right. Let's see, zoning ordinances. I think one of our terms on the vocab list. I've got something similar to this in there. And this is where you get your actual laws or rules. We'll call them regulations that say you can only use certain parts of a city for certain specific kind of uses. And so as we've been talking about in this unit, as we've been going through, in most of your cities, especially when you're looking here in North America, if I'm going to make our closer connection, but we see this all over the world. And the three main areas usually you'll see zonation kind of coming into play is what we've talked about before: residential, commercial, and industrial. And so residential is where the people live, commercial is your businesses, and then industrial is where you have, factories and manufacturing and that kind of thing going on. And in a lot of cities, that's pretty much, it's kind of like almost like boundaries are drawn up and say, this is where we will have our residential zones. This is where commercial zones will be, and this will be industrial. and oftentimes trying to keep those somewhat separated from each other, so that each can kind of develop on its own. All right. When you're using this with urban planning, it is, and and cities find themselves in various kind of situations where they get behind with planning, and then they're playing catch up, and they're trying to control growth that is probably out of control, what they call sprawl. And so when we think about zoning, I mean that's what the real goal and the purpose of it is to on the one hand to promote growth, but at the same time to have some control over it, and so that you don't end up with a city where you got zones in just colliding with each other and creating issues. All right. If we break this down, residential zones, residential density gradient is just basically the idea that that you're going to see your highest level of residential density. And so, in other words, I mean, the most people living in the smallest amount of space. You're going to see that a little bit closer as you get towards the central business district, but then as it keeps moving outward, it's going to decrease. And pretty soon that density is going to start flipping over into sparsely populated areas. But the density gradient is pretty much again nothing too complicated here. That we see less of that population density in residential areas the further away we get from the CBD. All right. Filtering kind of ties in with this, and filtering is something we see over time when we talk about right there when housing passes from one group to another. It's kind of like the idea that maybe you have a neighborhood that is new built, and the houses are nice, and most of the people who live in them are middle class, upper middle class. But 10 years, 20 years later, the houses are starting to kind of show their age, and a lot of the people who live there start moving off to other neighborhoods that are new homes again, and maybe bigger homes and that sort of thing. And then another group comes in who buys the older homes, and doesn't have to invest as much wealth, and probably doesn't have the same level of wealth as the group that's moving out. When you see that kind of movement going in, okay, that is what filtering is. And what I mean by good and bad over there on the right side is there is good and bad to this. Filtering can end up resulting in some housing inequities, where some people are edged out of housing sometimes because of things they can't control. From it could be their racial makeup, their cultural ethnicity, it could be their religion. Those kinds of things can sometimes get mixed up in all of this. Invasion and succession has a connection to filtering, and it's a terrible sounding term because I mean it's the idea of what people coming in and invading your neighborhood, and again this is another one. It gets controversial because sometimes when that kind of terminology is being used, the people who are quote unquote invading might get that kind of a description because they don't look like, or act like, or worship like the people who are already there. And so this is when you have filtering going on, and some people are moving from one place to another, whether they're moving up in the world or just wanting newer homes, whatever. But when you see kind of like the entire characteristic of a residential area, of a neighborhood change, because the people who are filtering in maybe just aren't of a different economic status, but are also maybe people who are who started from an ethnic enclave and now are moving into a neighborhood. And so you're seeing that change in just the culture of a neighborhood. And so that is that concept of invasion and succession. And again, like filtering, it's kind of like there's some aspects of this where it's good. I mean, you're potentially you're looking at people having access to better housing. It might not be the best, but it's better from what they come from. But the flip side is there's always kind of this potential for that housing inequity that can sometimes kind of come in with all of this. Let's see. Gated communities, McMansions. Yeah, gated communities are basically just that. They are communities, typically wealthier communities, and a lot of times have only a few access roads to get in and out, and they are surrounded by either walls or gates, and that is to, there's no bones about it. It's to keep people out. The only people that can go in are residents, and a lot of times, you'll find that those are neighborhoods that have very well manicured lawns and common spaces, very nice homes, that sort of thing. And then McMansions, kind of a weird early 2000s phenomenon that we saw here in the United States. There's a few other parts of the world have seen some of it, but United States where we've seen, where a lot of people who were able to move themselves up financially because of, job, social status, whatever it may be. But the building of a lot of these, they're not massive big mansions. They're kind of like mini mansions. They got the term McMansions because they were popping up so frequently in different parts of the United States. A lot of them ended up being basically empty mansions after the financial crisis in 2008, when a lot of people sunk themselves way into debt to buy these kind of places, and found themselves after 2008 where they owed more money for the house than it was worth anymore. Anyhow, it was, to some people, it was kind of a show of, hey, I've made it. I've worked hard, and now I can afford this big place. I got my 3-car garage and all that sort of thing. To other people, it was kind of a showing off of wealth, and sometimes a showing off of wealth that some people really didn't have. That kind of a concept. All right. And then I think I'm just going to finish you off. Just get down here at the bottom of this one. So yeah, I guess it is kind of the end of this section too. So that's great. And that is what probably some of you are seeing in and around the areas where you live in Clark County. And that is this idea of the suburbanization of business. Is something we've really seen in the last 20, 30 years here in a lot of parts of the United States. And that is kind of, well, we were talking about this, even with some Latin American examples, maybe like the Griffin Ford model. And that is this idea of some of the businesses that traditionally are in the central business district, now starting to spread themselves out and kind of going to where they know the customers might be a little bit closer, where they don't have to commute as far to access their businesses. Also, a lot of times their employees also not having to commute as far. If they actually move their businesses into commercial zones that are in the suburbs. And so, this is kind of where we've seen the rise of strip malls and that sort of thing. And it is a model that is followed because of profitability. A lot of businesses find that they do quite well operating that way, that they see that we're closer to our customer base and that kind of a thing. All right. I am in over 30 minutes on this, and yeah, it's 12:30. I'm getting tired. So we'll cut it right there, and this is where we will pick up again when we were probably together in class, and we'll be moving on to the political organization of cities as we slowly march our way toward the end of this thing. All right. But that'll do it for now. See you soon.